Okay. Now, Chapter 4 of the Obligations and Contract relates to extinguishment of the obligation. What do you mean by extinguishment of the obligation? It simply means that the obligation has now ended. Okay? If it has ended, it means it has no more force and effect. Okay? So the effect in extinguishment of obligation is that the obligation assumed cease to have legal effects. Hence, will not be binding upon the obligor, and the obligee has no right to demand performance. Okay? It simply marks the end of the obligation. That is extinguishment, effect in the extinguishment of the obligation. Okay? All accessory clause dependent upon the existence of the obligation shall likewise be extinguished. Okay? So since there is no more effect, anything that is attached to the obligation will also be gone. In short, extinguishment of the obligation marks the end of the obligation. So how does an obligation is extinguished? How does it how is an obligation be extinguished? Okay. There are 6 grounds mentioned by law in order to extinguish obligation. First ground is payment or performance. Meaning, the debtor simply performed the obligation or simply paid the obligation. Example, Juan promised Pedro a specific car. Okay. When Juan delivered the specific car, it means that there is performance of the obligation. Juan promised to pay Pedro the amount of 1,000 pesos. And when Juan pays Pedro the amount of 1,000 pesos, then the obligation is already extinguished by reason of payment on the part of Juan, who is the debtor in the obligation. Okay. What about if Juan pays only 500 pesos? Will the obligation be extinguished? Question, is there payment in that case? Okay. So we look at now the rules on payment. When can there be a valid payment? Now, in order for there to be a valid payment, there are 3 rules that you must follow. 1, the very thing or service contemplated must be paid. Which means that if the obligation speaks of money, it should be money which must be paid. If the obligation speaks of a car, it should be the car which should be delivered. Okay? If the obligation speaks of a service, it should be service which must be used to perform the obligation. Otherwise, that is not deemed considered as a valid payment. Second, fulfillment must be complete. So you cannot divide the payment. It should be the entire obligation. So if Juan borrowed 1,000, in order to extinguish the obligation by reason of a valid payment, Juan must pay the amount of 1,000. What if 500 lang ibayad? That is not complete. So it will not extinguish the obligation. Na ay mabilin ng obligation. And then last requisite for a valid payment is that it must be accepted by the creditor expressly or impliedly. Which means that when you pay, you should pay to the creditor, not to the other person. Oh, panalitan, Juan borrowed money from Maria. And then when Juan paid Maria, dito niya gibayad kay Pedro. Is there a valid payment? No, there is no valid payment because the payment is not accepted by the creditor. Okay? So you remember these 3 requisites for there to be a valid payment. Dapat na aning tulo para mo result siya into a valid payment. First, the very thing or service contemplated must be paid. Second, fulfillment must be complete. And then third, it must be accepted by the creditor expressly or impliedly. Okay? So that's the first ground for extinguishment of an obligation under payment or performance. Okay? There are other rules relating to payment which you can find starting slide number 75 of the synopsis that I have provided. You go over that different rules relating to payment. so that you will be familiarized with the different kinds of payment and the different rules applicable on payment. Now, second ground for extinguishment of obligation as mentioned by law is loss of the thing due. Nawala ang thing. Okay? Now, when we say lost, it means that when a thing perishes or goes out of commerce or disappears in such a way that its existence is unknown or cannot be recovered. Okay. Here, loss of the thing due can only result into an extinguishment of the obligation if these three requisites will be present. Number one, the obligation is to deliver a specific or determinate thing. Oh, remember pa mo aning specific or determinate thing? Diba? If we go back on our earlier discussion about classifications of obligations, we have classified different obligation according to subject, which could either be a real obligation or a personal obligation. When it comes to real obligation, it is further classified into real obligation to give a specific thing and real obligation to give a generic thing. Okay. Now, loss of the thing due as ground for extinguishment of an obligation can only be applicable or can only be used to extinguish obligation when the obligation is a real obligation to give a specific thing. Okay? If the object of the obligation is a generic thing, you cannot use loss of the thing due. Why? Because a generic object cannot be lost. Okay? A generic object cannot be lost. Like example of a generic object, uni-ball pen, color black. Okay? If you lost your uni-ball pen color black, there are always uni-ball pen color black available in store. So it cannot be lost. So this loss of the thing due can only be applicable when the obligation is an obligation to deliver a specific thing. Second, when the loss occurs without fault of the debtor. What happens if there is fault of the debtor? If it is fault of the debtor, the obligation will not be extinguished. Why? Because the debtor must pay. Must pay the value of the item or the value of the object of the obligation if the object has been lost by reason of his fault. Okay? Diba? Duties of the debtor in real obligation to give a specific thing, to take care of the thing as a good father of a family. Okay? Before delivery, he has the obligation to take care of that thing. What is the effect if he fails to perform that obligation? He can be held liable for damages. And that's the second requisite in order for loss of the thing due to be a ground for extinguishment of the obligation, which is the loss must occur without fault of the debtor. And then last requisite is that the debtor must not be guilty of delay. Okay? Even if the loss is without fault of the debtor, if you remember our fortuitous event special rule, in that case, we said that if the obligation cannot be performed by reason of a fortuitous event, the debtor cannot be held liable. The only exception is when the debtor is in delay already. Same rule also in loss of the thing due. Even if the debtor, it is not fault of the debtor where the thing is lost, but if the debtor is already in delay, the debtor can still be held liable. So again, in order for loss of the thing due result into an extinguishment of the obligation, the following requisites must be present. One, the obligation is to deliver a specific thing or determinate thing. Second, the loss occurs without fault of the debtor. And then third, the debtor is not guilty of delay. If there is a violation of this requisite, it will not result into an extinguishment of the obligation. Then we go now to the third grounds for extinguishing an obligation or extinguishment of obligation. This is condonation or remission of debt. So what do you understand about condonation or about remission of debt? Simply when you condone, which means murag imong gipasaylo. Okay? But masabot, gi-waive ni mo imong right over that particular thing. So in an obligation, you don't want anymore to collect because you have condoned the obligation of the debtor. Here, the gratuitous abandonment by the creditor of his right against the debtor. It is a form of a donation. Murag donation na lang siya. So since it is a form of a donation, the rules pertaining to donation must also be applicable. Okay? So, the different requisites are also enumerated, found under slide number 87. You go over those requisites. So, condonation simply means that you are condoning the obligation of the debtor. For example, Juan borrowed money from Pedro the amount of 1,000 pesos and promised to pay Pedro 1 month from receipt. Okay. Before 1 month arrives, ingon dayon si Pedro, Juan, no need to pay the 1,000 pesos. That means that Pedro condoned now the debt of Juan. So it is a donation. Anong donation man? Because wala naman siya nagpabayad. But pasabot, katong 1,000, nga giulaman ni Juan, iyan atong gihatag kay Juan as a form of a donation. Okay? So that is condonation or remission of debt. It will result now to the extinguishment of the obligation. And then fourth grounds for extinguishment of the obligation is confusion or merger of rights. Okay? Confusion or merger of rights. When you say merger of rights, it means that the debtor becomes now the creditor. The creditor becomes now the debtor. That's merger of rights. The debtor originally has now the right of the creditor. And the creditor originally has now a right of the debtor, or has now the obligation of the debtor. That's merger of rights. By definition, the law says that it is the meeting of one person of the qualities of the creditor and debtor with respect to the same obligation. Okay, example, A bought a car from B using check as payment. B endorsed the check to C. And then C, which later on endorsed it to A. Okay? So check ang gigamit nga pambayad ni A pagpalit niya og sakyanan. Originally, doon ay obligation si A ngadto kay B nga i-encash o punduhan ng cheque para ma-encash ni B. However, wala gipa-encash ni B. Gigamit pod ni B, gibayad niya ngadto kay C. So naa nang obligation karon kay A in favor kay C. Obligation nga punduhan ng cheque para mabayaran si C. But wala gipa-encash ni C. Instead, ning palit siya something from A. Ang iya pong gibayad is ang katong cheque originally gi-issue ni A. So originally, debtor si A. But pag abot sa cheque sa iya, nahimo po siyang creditor. So there is now a merger of rights. Nahimo siyang debtor and creditor at the same time over the same obligation. And what is that obligation? The obligation to fund the amount stated in the check. Okay? So since he is now a debtor and a creditor at the same time, then the obligation will be extinguished. And then fifth is compensation. Okay. In compensation, it is the extinguishment to the concurrent amount of debts of two persons who in their own rights are debtors and creditors of each other. Okay. Compensation meaning you are a debtor of the creditor. Later on, the creditor also becomes a debtor against the original debtor. That's compensation. When you say compensation, set off. Juan borrowed money 1,000 from Pedro. Later on, Pedro borrowed money from Juan 1,000 pesos. Oh, kinahanglan pa ba sila maningil? No more. The law says that the obligation is extinguished. Why is it extinguished? It would be impractical if Juan will be allowed to collect from Pedro. Because if that case, in that case, Pedro later on will also collect from Juan. So the law says you have to apply now the law on compensation. But the question is, what's the difference between compensation and merger of rights? Now, when you say merger of rights, the rules on merger of rights will only be applicable when there is only one obligation, same obligation. But sa compensation, although it's a different obligation, what is important here is that the creditor originally becomes the debtor of the original debtor. Okay? Then you can apply the rules on compensation. So there are requisites also found under slide number 90 on compensation. Go over it and study these requisites. And then the last ground, the last ground for extinguishment of obligation is what we call as novation. Okay? When you say innovation, it means change. Change of either the parties or change of either the object of the obligation. So if you're going to change the parties, it means that the original party will have no more obligation. And a new party will have now the obligation. If we change the object, it means that there is no more obligation to perform that original object, but instead on the new object. So by definition, novation is the total or partial extinction of an obligation through the creation of a new one which substitutes it. It is a substitution or change of an obligation by another, which extinguishes or modifies the first, either by changing its object, the principal conditions, or by substituting another in place of the debtor, or by subrogating third person in the rights of the creditor. So when we say example of innovation is, Juan promised to deliver Pedro a Toyota Fortuner car with plate number KFJ 111. Later on, Juan and Pedro agreed, I forgo with Toyota Fortuner. Just give me Toyota Vios. So here, there is a change of object. What will happen now? On the original obligation to deliver the Toyota Fortuner KFG 111, the law says that it is already extinguished. On what reason? Novation. Why? Because there is a change now of the object. Nawala na ang Toyota Fortuner car, kundi Toyota Vios na lang. In that case, the obligation, the original obligation to deliver Toyota Fortuner car is no more. It is gone. But a new obligation is created. That is to deliver a Toyota Vios. So that's the simplest explanation of novation. So there are different kinds of novation. Go over it as found under slide number 92. So that ends up obligations. Okay.